Namaste. So in our series on the Brahma-sūtras, we have reached a point where the discussion goes beyond the comprehension of most everybody, including, unfortunately, the majority of our viewers, apparently, at least as far as I can gauge from the comments, nobody is getting it. So what are these points, or what are these principles that Śaṅkarācārya is elucidating from the scriptures, from the Upanishads? Because the Upanishads are the ultimate source of knowledge about Brahman. Well, there's two of them. One is that Brahman is never the object of an action, including the action of perception or consciousness. In other words, Brahman is imperceptible. Why? Because Brahman is the self. And the self cannot perceive itself. It can only perceive its reflection in various phenomena. But those are not the self, because they're temporary, changeable, conditioned, and limited, and so on and so on. The self has no qualities. And especially, it does not have the quality of being the object of any kind of action or work. Similarly, by the same token, or for the same reason, self-realization is not the result of any action. Ramana Maharshi was fond of saying, the self is already realized. And the proof of this is, go on the street and ask anybody, do you exist? And they'll say, yes, of course I exist. Are you conscious? Yes, obviously I'm conscious. Then everybody has realized the self. Everybody knows that they exist, and they are conscious. But how do they know? This is the tricky part. Well, the self is simply awareness. Of what? Of awareness. So awareness of awareness, this is called turiya. And turiya is the principal symptom of Brahman. Wherever there is self-awareness, we see it even in animals. Animals are aware that they exist. If you haven't had a close encounter with an animal lately, just go hang out with your friend's dog or cat. And then tell me, do they know they exist? Yep, they sure do. They will resist any kind of attack or limitation on their freedom. They will resist any kind of maltreatment. See, and this is because they know that they are. And because they are, they have a right to self-defense and self-preservation and so on. This is given in the Puranas as the highest duty of any living being, is self-preservation, and one can act in any way required to achieve it. This is the one exception to the rule that one must not do harm. That if there is a threat to one's survival, one has the right to defend oneself. But this does not apply to Brahman, because Brahman is indestructible. Why is it indestructible? Because it's changeless. It cannot be altered in any way. And similarly, self-realization is not the result of any action. Now, this is the point where people get hung up. And the reason they get hung up is because in the scriptures, there are many, many passages claiming that this process, let's say meditation or mantras or puja or jagna or study of the Vedas or this or that, charity whatsoever, will result or will bring you to self-realization. Now, is the scripture lying? Is the scripture making false statements? Well, this is also elucidated by Śaṅkarācārya in his introduction to his commentary on Bhagavad Gita. Let me read an excerpt. There are passages in Bhagavad Gita that appear to accord the path of action the highest place among spiritual disciplines. The Acharya explains these as falling under Arthava, praise, eulogy. Arthava means overpraising a thing to enthuse the listener to betake himself to it. Arthava. We could translate this as sales talk. Chant this mantra, do this puja, do this meditation, do that, do the other thing. This will bring you to pure awareness and self-realization. Well, not exactly. The most that any action can do is to prepare you for self-realization by purifying the mind, by dissolving one's previous karma. What is the proof of that? Well, it's right there in Bhagavad Gita itself. Bhagavad Gita explains there are two paths of spiritual development. One is known as the path of action, pravriti marg, and the other, the path of knowledge, nivriti marg. Now, here's that word again, vritti. What does vritti mean? It means a modification, a change. For example, Patanjali defines yoga as chitta vritti nirodha, meaning the complete cessation of all modifications of consciousness. So, if yoga, which is the act of self-realization, the process that leads to self-realization, is defined as chitta vritti nirodha, cessation of the modifications of the mind, that means there is an original state of the mind unmodified by any changes. That is Brahman. Chitta vritti nirodha, that is the path of knowledge. That is the nivriti marg, nivriti, no changes, no modifications. And pravriti marg is the path of action. Do this, do that, do the other things, study the Vedas, chant these mantras, do these pujas, etc., etc., etc. So then, does Bhagavad Gita deceive us when it says path of action leads to self-realization? Well, sorta. Because it does lead to self-realization indirectly by preparing us for the path of consciousness, the path of knowledge. One has to become purified of all desires for limited, conditioned, material things. As long as these desires persist, one's intelligence is covered by upadhis. What are upadhis? The idea that I am this body, I am this mind, I am these thoughts, I am these desires. So in this way, we become identified with material things and we lose our original consciousness, our chitta vritti nirodha, our nivriti marga. That becomes covered over because we identify with these material bodies, minds, thoughts, desires, actions, etc. So just as Brahman cannot ever change or engage in action of any kind, or be the object of any kind of action, in the same way, the self never changes, is never subject to any kind of action, can never be modified or changed in any way. So in other words, as we said earlier, the self is already realized. We are already Brahman. We are already the self. We simply have to recognize the fact. But this is not possible as long as we are covered by upadhis. So the path of action, the pravritti marg, is to clear away all these false definitions of the self, all these false ideas, and certainly all these desires that lead to becoming contaminated with karma. And because of karma, then we have to take birth again and again in this material world. We want to finish that. So to finish it, we have to clear away all this nonsense and be restored to our original nature. The original nature is still there underneath. It is the substrate on which the upadhis are superimposed, covering it. The example is given of the rope and the snake. The rope is the substrate, and the snake is the upadhi, the imagined identity of this object, which is superimposed on it by the mind, the chittavrittis. Or let's use the example of a mirage in the desert. Sometimes in the desert, one sees what appears to be water. Of course, there's no water. There's no lake in the desert. It's an illusion caused by the refraction of sunlight in the boundary layer, the inversion layer of temperature just above the hot sand. The hot sand is the substrate, and the refraction of the sunlight is the upadhi superimposed on it. So this is the nature of the so-called material reality. It's not reality at all. It's an illusion. It's maya, that which is not. I don't know exactly why this is. It's hard to remember even what that was like. For me, anyway. But I think it has to do with the sales talk in the scriptures, the Arthava. And if you look, it's everywhere in the dualistic scriptures like Mahabharata, the Puranas, the Tantras, and so on. So then how do we overcome this? How do we reach the actual truth? Well, we can study the Upanishads. The Upanishads deliver it straight up, no sales talk. And I mean, compared with other religions, especially the dualistic religions of the West, the Vedic culture is very, very close to the truth. We simply have to study it, hear from people who are realized, and then look within and recognize it in ourselves. Aum Tat Sat. Aum Shakti Aum. Aum Namah Shivaya.